My name is Bobby Fishkin, and I'm a founder of CrowdDoing. And I'm here today to talk with you because we have this initiative on medicinal foods, citizen science. And what that means is, have you ever thought about foods that have function? Foods that affect your stress, foods that affect your anxiety, foods that affect your sleep. We think these are self-sensible. And citizen science is a form of participatory medicine in which people observe themselves and contribute to the future of science by communicating that information into a collaborative knowledge and into scientific knowledge. And we think that each person, through our app, our medicinal foods app, can, in the version 2.0, our HIPAA compliant forthcoming release, we hope that we'll be able to allow each person to test 10 different kinds of occasions when a given medicinal food can be tested for themselves and learn, on each occasion, did it work, and then build a medicinal food toolkit of the ones that work. And we think that over scale, that's possible as an alternative to what we've achieved in terms of achieving evidence of effectiveness in pharmaceuticals, because pharmaceuticals over the last 100 years have had a tremendous number of randomized controlled trials compared to medicinal foods, 100 times more plus. And we think there's an opportunity to have medicinal foods tested through big data and through citizen science, as well as through machine learning and data science. So we have one working group working on the public data reviews of recipes and reviews of foods that might connect to data about anxiety and sleep and stress. And we have another group of volunteers working on qualitative analysis and quantitative review of existing clinical evidence and scientific evidence of the effectiveness of different foods. And then we believe that there's a cluster analysis in data science that can happen once we get to the point of understanding combinations of foods and recipes and the compounding effects of some mechanisms of medicinal foods. We have a team that includes health expertise, and we welcome each of the traditions of medicinal foods that apply to this: Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, and we also have Native American medicine that connects to this. And all these themes of medicinal food actually come together if we can bring in a scientific basis for people to understand, did the green tea affect their anxiety? Did the cherry juice affect their sleep? Did any of these medicinal foods achieve their intended function? Because the function that we're testing is, can medicinal food achieve a role for individuals? Now, the history of citizen science has been starting in environmental contexts where people have studied bird counting and counting different kinds of plants, and then it's extended to microbiome citizen science projects to study that. And the context of medicinal foods and citizen science is saying that there's a real opportunity to have collaboration make medicinal foods evidence trustable. So, what is an evidence oasis? An evidence oasis is when we have enough evidence to make the right decisions. A food desert is when we lack food. A food swamp is when we have lots of unhealthy food or misleading food. A evidence desert is when we lack evidence. An evidence swamp is when we have misleading evidence or a signal to noise ratio that's broken. And in medicinal foods, we have misleading evidence. We also have evidence scarcity, and yet there's an opportunity to create evidence oases. The term oasification was invented 20 years ago. It was invented as a term to describe when deserts and swamps become oases, and we think evidence oasification is possible through medicinal foods, through citizen science, through big data and machine learning, through taking the data that we have about ourselves and connecting that to processes by which we can come to trust when foods represent alternative functional medicine for us to achieve functional goals. And we think that there's sustainable development goals that are achievable through that. We think that there's ways in which public health, mental health goals are achievable through medicinal foods, as well as physical health goals. We think the subset of these that are self-sensible is a low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and represents a opportunity for impact that we're recruiting global volunteers for, from all fields that are of relevance that people want to service learn or micro lead in or contribute pro bono. That includes computer science, that includes data science, that includes nutritionists and people with expertise on Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine, and people who have food psychology expertise and people who have other expertise related to the biology of medicinal foods. We welcome all the fields that need to come together in order to help us with this evidence oasification process. Thank you, and we look forward to collaborating on the CrowdDoing Medicinal Foods Citizen Science team.
Intradisciplinary professional norms. So if we work with project managers and don't leverage the parts that are useful from existing project management process, then they get frustrated because we're too discontinuous. Now, we don't say that we want to use everything from the expectations of each of these traditions, because project management as a field should consider the interests of stakeholders and not just perception management of stakeholders. And we don't want to just reuse the fields and the tools, but where the tools from startup world can be reused, we often have adopted. We have day-to-day used Google Drive and Google Meet, and we've used Slack for 15,000 messages, for example, within our medicinal foods team. We've had about 30 Trello boards that we've used to coordinate on some other teams in terms of Kanban and wish lists. And we've, within the data science and machine learning team, we've had definitely a set of code on Bitbucket that we've used, and created some maps of reusable libraries from different parts of the open source community that are connectable to the project, and scrapers and spiders that can be reused for the sake of public health. This is our medicinal food citizen science to understand sleep, stress, and anxiety in terms of what foods and herbs can be beneficial for people to address that, and in what combinations, and with what chance of effectiveness, and how can we change the evidence base of medicinal foods to reach parity with the pharmaceutical world. So that's one set of tools that, in a context of a team, we use. I mean, we use a lot of where is there evidence through different kinds of ways of knowing for foods and herbs that could be relevant to stress, sleep, and anxiety as goals for individuals. So we've been saying that our volunteers have looked at data streams that exist in the world about these medicinal foods. There's limited evidence of some medicinal foods, and some have better evidence. But what we've been trying to do is say, okay, at a health science level, there's randomized control trials that are linked to on there's a Natural Medicines website and a Green Med Info website that link, for example, to randomized control trials that have been conducted to test some of these medicinal foods in the past and some of these herbs in the past. And then there's also categories of those. For example, for stress and anxiety, Green Med Info identifies more than 140 foods that affect stress or anxiety. Our nutritionists and pharmacists on our team have identified some categories, about 10 categories, to be ones that overlap between those 140 foods that have some clinical evidence of relevance and the federal data. Federal data has tryptophan, for example. They have very good data on tryptophan. You can see tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, and its presence and abundance is incompatible with cortisol. So if you have enough serotonin going on, it is an effective way to reduce stress. But it's not a fast tactic to reduce stress. It will take weeks of eating bananas to achieve an anti-stress goal via tryptophan alone, because bananas contain tryptophan. But there's other medicinal foods that work more quickly. Valerian root, for example, is within hours an anti-stress effect. Yes. And so is California poppy, and so is eleuthero, and so is passion flower. But the herbs and foods that have effect quickly are not those that are counted in the federal data. So the federal data just contains studies of the foods and herbs that have an effect but might take weeks to have effect, or a month or two to have effect. But many individual humans, when they feel stressed, they're trying to address that more immediately. So we're aiming to look at both data sets, both the data of for the 10 things like tryptophan, we have a list of 10,000 foods plus from the federal government, and from there's a website, My Foods Data, that aggregated that in part, and we have great data for it, great granularity. But the federal data didn't look at non-essential amino acids, and it didn't look at the other these 140 categories. 130 of them are left out. So we need other ways of understanding what medicinal foods can be effective for stress, sleep, and anxiety. So we've approached that in several ways. One is we've downloaded hundreds of thousands of products details from different sources, including Kaggle had a data set that we started with, and then we've created other tools to extract additional information from various sources. So within that, we did a first process of natural language processing to look at people who mentioned that this helped their stress or their sleep or their anxiety in the review. And then we also looked at whether they contained one of the 140 ingredients that were in the Green Med Info list. And so then we, saw that you can indeed filter down to products that contain medicinal foods, but then we found that almost very small percentage of them were individual medicinal foods. Most of them turned out to be combinations of medicinal foods. A tea might have 5 or 10 medicinal foods as ingredients, or a tincture or a powder might have a group of them. So then what we began to look at is, can we evaluate synergism between medicinal foods? Do you know the word synergism in that sense? So if we're looking at this from the perspective of what medicinal foods mutually reinforce each other's effect. So which ones increase the effect of each other. And so in terms of that, we've approached that both theoretically in natural medicine's website. There's some information around what medicinal foods ought to, in theory, reinforce each other or mitigate each other's effects. And then there's also a data science layer to that, because if we suppose we were to get to the point where we have millions of foods in a data lake, and we were able to say which combinations of medicinal foods have been reviewed as more effective than others, we should be able to see there may be some variables that we'll need to control for, like some manufacturers may be better than others, and so they might outperform or underperform the ingredient list, or there may be formulas in which these 3 ingredients, when they're in order A, B, C, but not C, B, A, outperform the averages. But there's 2 threads. One is our data science in the current phase for saying what is the average user going to experience, what is the average person. A future phase is personalization, to say what is this person going to experience because they're similar to this cluster of people. So there's sort of the variation within that. And then there's a third level of this, which is how do we validate that with a real user. So we've been building an application of discovery of medicinal foods, and we've been working towards a future version in which people can test did the medicinal foods work for me? Did the ashwagandha reduce my stress? Did the rhodiola reduce my stress? And we think that there's potential for both citizen science and data science, because over the last 100 years, there's been many, many, many times more randomized control trials of pharmaceuticals than medicinal foods. And that's created an asymmetry of evidence, not an asymmetry of effectiveness. And so, what we're aiming to do is build different ways of seeing the evidence from not only health and clinical data, but other sources. So, for example, we have another part of our data science team that's been extracting social media data of all the nutritionists and pharmacists and doctors who've mentioned medicinal foods for stress, sleep, and anxiety. And which ones have they mentioned? So, some of these medicinal foods are buried in um, contexts where people are not familiar with them. Others are more known. Some of that is a question of narrative and history. We find that subcultures and people that are have a connection to one of the traditions of medicinal food, such as Native American medicinal food or Ayurvedic medicinal food or traditional Chinese medicine, have more familiarity. But we also think that these foods apply more broadly. I think that there's one part of medicinal foods history which has been the narrative has gotten stuck in particular cultural traditions. So, for example, rhodiola was what the Vikings took, according to a podcast of a nutritionist I saw not too long ago. The Vikings took rhodiola before battle for hundreds of years, and that has one tradition of use. And in Scandinavia and Europe, they've tested rhodiola, and in other parts of the world, they've tested other medicinal foods. But what we're aiming for is a global usefulness of medicinal foods for any person to be able to say, okay, here's, from a functional medicine point of view, I face stress, I face anxiety, or I have a challenge sleeping, and I want to access individual medicinal foods and combinations of medicinal foods that can address my goals. I think that there's what we've tended to start with. If someone sees a nutritionist, they're going to start with subtraction. They're going to start by saying, "What are you taking that is hurting you?" We're not a human as an app or as a accessible process, so we're starting with what could we add that could help you, and then maybe in a future version someday we can also work on the question of helping people subtract. But we're starting with the idea that most people are not aware of 99% of the medicinal foods plus that are available to them. Maybe they take green tea, maybe they have a banana, but they're not really aware of the panoply of possibility of medicinal foods and herbs for stress, sleep, and anxiety. And so what we're aiming to do is, help them discover tools that are usable and useful to them and meaningful to them. And then that, includes different questions of knowability and epistemology. Can we know this from a medical point of view? Can we know this from a data science point of view? Can we know this from a user evidence, user testing point of view? Can we know this from a traditional medicine or traditional expertise of 3,000 years of other evidence and history and practice point of view? What we're doing in this project that is different than traditional health approaches is we're looking for the signal amid the noise from any way of knowing this information. We're not limiting ourselves to data science or limiting ourselves to health research or limiting ourselves to traditional medicine or limiting ourselves to citizen science where people test it for themselves. We're aiming to connect any way of knowing that would help an individual navigate this terrain. We're trying to leverage that to make this feasible. Over the last few thousand years, there's been medicinal foods and herbs used in traditional Chinese medicine, in Ayurvedic medicine, in Native American medicine, and in also in there have been European medicinal food traditions too. And across all of those uses, those have applied to all ailments. But what we focus on in our medicinal foods for stress, sleep, and anxiety team at CrowdDoing is, those specific challenges. What does that information of those traditions of medicinal foods mean for a person who faces the condition of stress or the condition of anxiety or challenges with their sleep? So, what we've done is said, can we connect a multidisciplinary group of people, pharmacists, nutritionists, people interested in data science, people who are engineers, people like yourself who are user experience experts. Can we connect these people to the challenge of demystifying what is already known about medicinal foods, to figuring out what is discoverable about medicinal foods and herbs through research, connecting that as software to a process for people to become self-aware of this. So if you think about, have you ever heard of the term quantified self? So this is the idea that you can keep track of attributes of yourself, like how many hours did you sleep each night this week, or other kinds of data about the self that can create self-awareness and self-consciousness. So there's that tradition in a Silicon Valley tradition of quantifying information about self, but we think that suppose 10 million people tried taking different medicinal foods for 10 years and tried various combinations of them and reported back to some kind of central data process. Would it be possible for medicinal foods to achieve evidence in the way that pharmaceuticals have achieved? Because over the last more than 100 years, there's been patent incentives for pharmaceuticals. In order to get licensed, they need to conduct randomized controlled trials. And so there have been many, many tests of pharmaceuticals compared to medicinal foods, which may have effectiveness for a given condition or not, but if it hasn't been evidenced, it won't be recommendable by many of the professional health stakeholders that people turn to for advice. So what we're saying is not the preliminary version of the app, which is focused on discovery as a use case, but the destination version of the application that we've been working towards is, can we help people determine what medicinal foods and herbs work for their own stress for them successfully, and use that individual level data to create aggregate level data to help us collectively understand what medicinal foods and herbs work for everyone's stress, sleep, and anxiety. There's 100 years of backlog due to patent incentives, right? Where over the last 100 years, there's been disproportionate testing of pharmaceuticals compared to medicinal foods and herbs. And so, what we're saying is that in order to prevent these risks from stress, sleep, and anxiety more, we need to collaborate with millions of people over as long a time frame as a decade to reach parity with, to catch up the medicinal foods and herbs to the levels of evidence that pharmaceuticals have arrived at after 100 years of having a lopsided playing field in which all the economic incentives have been to gather evidence on pharmaceuticals almost, and that has meant that these incredible tools that we have, these medicinal foods, are understudied compared to their impact potential. We've been building towards the goal of each person understanding what are the pathways to manage their stress. For example, they can take um, Valerian Root and have an immediate effect, or they can take tryptophan, which is in bananas, and have an effect over the course of a couple months, or they can take omega 3s, and that can have an effect over the course of a couple of months. And so GABA is a pathway that many pharmaceuticals use to manage stress that's fear based or anxiety that's fear based. And it's also a kind of tea, and it's also an ingredient in many other products. And but understanding for people, I'm in a grocery store, I'm in a restaurant, I'm on ordering online, and I want to navigate the routes to addressing my stress by identifying, maybe I've only used omega 3s and tryptophan. I've never used valerian, ashwagandha, rhodiola, schisandra, and each of these has a different mechanism by which I can address my stress goals. How do we help people discover new pathways of addressing their stress goals and preventing their stress and anxiety challenges? So, in other words, part of what we're doing is saying that while there's 140 medicinal food ingredients that have had randomized control trials studying them, that GreenMedInfo identified, there's also the question of when these foods are effective for what particular populations. Are they is this person used to these pathways? They've used passion flower, but they've never used valerian, and there's other ways to address their goals. So, from a functional medicine point of view, medicinal foods and herbs are tools, and we're identifying how do we democratize access to these tools by helping us understand, when these approaches that we're taking are using 10 kinds of wrenches, and what we need is a hammer for that kind of challenge because our brain is working such a way that that pathway wasn't as effective as this other pathway for us, and helping people diversify their approaches to self-care through discovery and self-testing of medicinal foods and herbs. Well, we've had 18 months and 100 volunteers plus collaborating. We've got a first version of the Discovery app with a completed back-end code and a rough version of a sort of starting use case MVP style of it. We had a prototype app a year ago that we started with, and then we've had a data science team extract large numbers of reviews, and we've been conducting data science on the ingredients that are shared in common in terms of some medicinal foods use overlapping combinations of ingredients, and we're trying to say, do these ingredients, do we have every time these three ingredients show up, maybe the performance is better from what we can evidence from natural language processing or what we can evidence from ratings. We have a health review of what evidence is there that these ingredients are likely to be synergistic with those ingredients. We have a service learning process where we're aiming to build a comfort of medicinal food literacy. We're aiming to give people the skill to recognize stress and anxiety challenges, the skill to recognize are they self-aware of their degree of stress and anxiety or sleep challenges, helping them build the skill to identify different medicinal foods and herbs that can be effective for this. So, in other words, we see the application and as a frame of delivery of knowledge, and then we see service learning as a frame to scale collaboration in terms of all those who want to help us build the knowledge. So, in other words, adopt a food has been what our marketing team came up with to say people can adopt a food and help us create a narrative around that food in terms of its history and impact potential and clinical evidence and scientific evidence and nutritional evidence, as well as the use cases in which it's been discovered in terms of products or recipes or contexts. And what we're identifying is that medicinal foods are a form of social innovation when they're discovered in functional medicine terms to be useful to us. And what we're aiming to do is demystify where they are useful to us and in what ways and for what reasons, whether that's because uh, tryptophan is precursor to serotonin, or because we can see that the lupulone humalones of valerian root and passion flower and uh, California poppy are an overlapping mechanism. So someone who's tried those and they have worked really well would find that other herbs in the same family might be likely to work well as additionally. And if those herbs in that family haven't worked for them, it's likely that they should try a different approach with a different active mechanism and discover a different dimension. But the reality is that the body is a complex system, and systems thinking is not a democratized skill. And we have the thesis that the first step to systems thinking is understanding that your body is a system, and understanding that you can create these social innovation inputs into that system, and you can become self-aware of the consequences of that as you reduce cortisol, or as you feel a reduction of stress or anxiety, and that can be a gateway for people to understanding more about this system of medicinal foods and herbs that are relevant to stress, sleep, and anxiety. And across CrowdDoing, we try to apply systems thinking as a lens to approach any problem, sort of connected to design thinking, but applying it from the perspective of where can we have agency vis-a-vis these systems. And one of the sort of most comfortable starting points for people to have agency is if they can choose to eat these medicinal foods of one kind or another, and over time have agency about their self care and self management that can also be connectable to agency in other contexts of life. But medicinal foods and herbs is one that's mysterious to the vast bulk of people, and very few people have agency vis-a-vis it. And so, I think from an intuitive point of view, it's a very powerful thing that because there was ambiguity about it, because it was sort of between the traditional medicine and modern medicine, it was getting neglected by so much of the scientific community, but not for good reasons. There's so many reasons to say, what is available to us at a theoretical level, what is available to us at a real world level are different things. And physics is the science of what's theoretically provable, often in the abstract. But medicinal foods, very much takes advantage of this particular reality that we've happened to inherit it. So there's a sense in which some of the scientific emphasis has gone on to what is theoretically provable, or what is of cataclysmic relevance. People, we have other initiatives that focus on climate change and things, but if we cannot connect to where we have the most potential for agency, our own system of self, how are we going to address the broader systems change of the world? And I think that has been something really relevant to thinking about. Can we build through collaboration the ability to demystify this field that gets neglected because it falls between the fields? And as a theory of systems thinking, being the interconnection between the fields, being some of the most important places, these junctures that get neglected due to the benign neglect of historical forces of these disciplines not being co-known by the same person, and therefore don't get brought together. These are the opportunities for systems change that are really incredible, because they're not that far away. They're quite accessible, but we don't notice them because we're so used to the context that we're in. But we've been discovering that our pharmacist volunteer, in a U.S. based pharmacist volunteer of ours, for example, is identifying that one of the most frequent questions they get is what herbal medicine option alternatives are there to their work at the pharmacy. And I think that there's a really interesting thing that they're getting those questions. There's a relatively small percentage of the country who directly see a naturopath or a nutritionist or a natural medicine practitioner that might provide expert feedback. And there is also all of these tools that some of which are as common as a banana, and others of which people need to seek out in order to be able to get ashwagandha tea. They'll have to find a context where they can get it. But it doesn't mean that these are not tools that should be ubiquitously, comfortably accessible by any human anywhere dealing with stress, sleep, and anxiety. This should just be a whole category. These 25 mechanisms plus that have been demystified to a great extent by science already. We should be learning these as part of growing up human. And you're welcome to join for whatever calls you're available to join for, and not for the ones that you're otherwise committed for, because we aim to make it convenient to change the world, because that's the only way that we can scale our solutions to the scale they're needed, is to make it low friction to collaborate in that creative way.